Μ' ακούτε, έτσι? Ωραία.
Επιτέλους ξεκινάμε, συγχωρείτε για την καθυστέρηση, έπρεπε να βολέψουμε όλο τον κόσμο. Μ' ακούτε? Εκ μέρους του University in Athens και των εκδόσεων Nissos, ήθελα να σας καλωσορίσω όλους εδώ απόψε, να σας ευχαριστήσω πάρα πολύ για την παρουσία σας και να σας πω ότι είμαι πολύ χαρούμενη που έχουμε τη συνεργασία με τις εκδόσεις Nissos, είναι η πρώτη μας συνεργασία και θα αφήσω την κυρία Καπόλα, που είναι η διευθύντρια των εκδόσεων Nissos, να παρουσιάσει τον κύριο Καντάβα.
Καλησπέρα και από μένα. Είχα σκοπό να παρουσιάσω έτσι, το βιογραφικό του Εντουάρντο, αλλά από ό,τι βλέπω και από την προσέλευση νομίζω ότι είναι μάλλον πολύ γνωστός και όλοι περίπου ξέρετε. Παρ' όλα αυτά, πέρα από πολύ αγαπημένος φίλος και συνεργάτης των εκδόσεων, ο Εντουάρντο είναι καθηγητής στο τμήμα Αγγλικής Φιλολογίας του Πανεπιστημίου Princeton. Από το 2009 ως το 2017 υπήρξε επικεφαλής του Wilson College και επιμελητής της σειράς διαλέξεων του Wilson College. Ειδικεύεται στην αμερικάνικη λογοτεχνία και τον πολιτισμό, τη συγκριτική λογοτεχνία, τις τεχνολογίες των μέσων, την πολιτική θεωρία της μετάφρασης. Έχει πάρα πολύ πλούσιο συγγραφικό έργο, το οποίο δεν ανησυχείτε, δεν θα σας το παραθέσω όλο τώρα. Να πω λίγο τα βασικά. Έχει γράψει το βιβλίο Λέξη Φωτός Θέση για τη φωτογραφία της ιστορίας, το οποίο έχει βγει και στα ελληνικά από τις εκδόσεις Nissos. Επίσης, το βιβλίο Emerson and the Climate of History, Fazal Say Portraits. Έχει συνεπιμεληθεί τα βιβλία Who Comes After the Subject και Cities Without Citizens. Επίσης, έχει επιμεληθεί πάρα πολλές εκθέσεις φωτογραφίας και στην Ευρώπη και στην Αμερική. Στην Ελλάδα έχουμε την τύχη να τον έχουμε πολύ συχνά κοντά μας και συμμετέχει σε διάφορα project. Φέτος, για παράδειγμα, παρέδωσε στο σεμινάριο Γενεολογίας της Μήνης και της Διάλεξης, λογοτεχνία και φωτογραφία στο μεταπτυχιακό πρόγραμμα του Τμήματος Πολιτικής Επιστήμης και Κοινωνιολογίας του Πανεπιστημίου Αθηνών. Αυτά τα ολίγα σας τον παραδείγμα.
Okay, thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank Liana and Paula for their welcome and their invitation to speak. Can you all hear me in the back? I usually can project, but I don't want the talk to be a rumor in the back of the room. But I also, this is a kind of combination of a talk that Paula had talked about my giving in relation to Nissos. But it's also the closing, let's say, session of the course that I taught this spring at the University of Athens in the Department of Political Science and Sociology. And so, among other things, I want to register my thanks to all the students in the class. It's been a really great experience for me. It's been very nice for me to teach here, and I want to thank my host for inviting me to teach here, and all the students for participating in the course. The talk I'm going to give today is drawn from a small book I'm writing on the photographic work of Susan Meiselas. I don't know how much all of you know about her work. I know some of you know about her work. She's a Magnum photographer. She's presently the president of the Magnum Foundation. She's mostly known for her work in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Kurdistan. And what I'm going to do is just begin with a few almost glossary terms, not really glossary terms, but just things that I think you need to know in order to register some of the things that I'm going to talk about. I've known Susan for many years, and one of the first times that we met, she told me that she would like me to write on her work. But she wanted us to become friends first, which I liked very much that she had said this. So many years went into the development of the friendship, but then at a certain point, a little over a year ago, she said that she actually had now decided what she wanted to do. So what she had wanted me to do was to write something for an exhibition that she was doing at the Tapias Foundation in Barcelona and the Jeux de Paume in Paris. And so the invitation was to basically write a small 3,000-word catalog essay, which, for various reasons which I won't go into now, I couldn't let the piece go. It ballooned into 23,000 words, and as I say, now will be a small book on her work. But one of the things that she had told me, and actually asked me to do, is she said that she wanted me to be the one in the catalog who pulls everything together. Which is to say, she has 40 years of work. She said, you know, I moved from El Salvador to Kurdistan. I changed continents. What stays the same? Okay, it's 40 years of work, a very diverse body of work. So as I was trying to think about what I could do, and actually feeling I couldn't do what I wanted to do at 3,000 words, I discovered a book that she had put together in 1974. It's actually her first book. It's out of print. It's not very well known. I hadn't known before. And it's a book that she put together when she was working in the Bronx, teaching in the Bronx. And she put together a little book, spiral bound, called Learn to See. And it's a book that is composed of 101 experiments and exercises that use photography in the classroom to teach children how to see differently, how to see more deeply, how to see more profoundly. And I just thought all of a sudden, well, this is a manual on how to see. It's a training manual on how to see and how to read. And then I realized that all of her projects are training manuals on how to read. And so what I did for the much longer piece than I was supposed to write is I selected 5 of the exercises, and I used them as a lens through which I could read the entire corpus. So I chose 5 exercises. I chose one entitled Alphabetography. This is the first exercise in the book, and it's a project, it's an exercise that invites the children to find letters of the alphabet in the world, even in shadows. An O, for example. So to gain a kind of literacy in relation to letters. The second project exercise that I used was called Before and After. It's off. No, because it went, it's off.
Can you hear in the back?
Yes.
Only because of me. No, but I can speak up if this is wrong. Okay, so the second project, you can hear me if I speak loudly. No? Okay, so the second project was called Before and After, and it was just what you can assume. It was a project where the children were asked to think about the relationship between a before and after. The third one was called Photo Swap. In this exercise, Susan would invite children, put them into 2 different groups, and ask them to take pictures. And then she would ask them to swap or exchange the pictures. And they would exchange pictures, form a diptych, and then she would ask the children to invent a story that would explain why these 2 pictures, taken in different places and different times, could be put together. The next section I used was called Doorways. And I kind of tracked all of the doorways in Susan's work, from doorways in prisons to doorways in different countries to doorways in S&M clubs in New York. And then the final exercise was an exercise simply called Traces. So what I'm going to do tonight is mostly read from the section that draws from the exercise Photo Swap. Although I'll have some references to the alphabetography section. Now. Okay.
On and off.
There are these nice moments and things like this happen. Okay, that's okay. Okay, so one of the things I want to do is just explain how I'm going to draw from that book, Learn to See. The other thing I want to do is just sort of 2 factual things. Susan goes to Nicaragua in '79. Any image, basically, that you know of the Nicaragua Revolution is Susan's image. She's the one who went there. She's the one who put her body there. She's the one who took the picture of the Molotov cocktail man, and so on. And she goes then, after documenting the revolution, she returns 10 years later to make a film. And what she does is she brings the book she had made on the basis of the images she had taken in '79. She brings the book back to Nicaragua and looks for the people that she had taken pictures of. And then she films her finding the people, asking them questions. And so it's extremely sad film to watch in some ways, because she captures let's say, the energy and activism of the revolution, where they actually win the revolution. And she goes back 10 years later, makes a film called Pictures from the Revolution, and basically interviews one person after another saying that nothing has changed. She then returns in 2004. Susan can never let anything go. She returns in 2004, and what she does there is she makes a project called Reframing History. And what she does is she installs mural-sized images of the images she had taken in the place where she took them. So in one way or another, what she does is she recalls what had taken place in these sites, what had taken place and which is no longer visible, very often no longer even known. It's a way of keeping the history that had taken place there. Now? Okay, so it seems that it has a timer. Okay, so alpha photography, photo swap, pictures from a revolution, reframing history. Okay, so I'll reference these things in the talk, so I just wanted you to know what they are. Okay. So I began in the conviction that it is impossible to view Susan's work in the present without an understanding of how this work is mediated by everything that came before, and how it even takes mediation as one of its primary traits. One of its primary traits in sites of exploration. It is precisely Susan's sense of a mediating character experience that allows her to explore the relation to microphone. So I'll project. So she notes the way in which our perception is always mediated by our history. The way in which our eyes can mostly only see through the histories and relations that have helped to compose them. When she speaks of how inevitable it is that we carry our history wherever we go. Speaking of the moment in which she moves from Latin America to Kurdistan, and of the relations between what she sees in both places, she explains, and this is the first passage in the handout that was circulated. I hope you all have one if you don't have anything to share. I carry these themes with me without even recognizing it. And I'm attracted like a magnet to the mass graves, destroyed villages, the missing, the themes and issues I've been involved with for the last 12 years. I had gotten to the point where there was context and continuity in my Latin American work. And I knew the history of the places I was in. And suddenly I was pulling myself out of that and landing in a place I knew absolutely nothing about. But I brought that other history with me. End quote. What she suggests is that, like each of her photographs, perception is always full of memories. Indeed, we would in fact be entirely unable to encounter anything without our memories, even if it is precisely these memories that often make it impossible for us to see what is before us in all its singularity. While these histories and mediations are, of course, multiple and heterogeneous, I want to recall one of Susan's earliest projects, a project she put together in 1974. I'm thinking of her project, Learn to See, because I want to suggest that its mediatory presence within her work has been mostly, and I think unjustly, neglected. I believe that if read properly, it can serve as a key to unraveling many of the traits that are so legible throughout all of her work. Indeed, the series of photographic projects that comprise it delineate a network of strategies and protocols that have persisted, even if in different forms, throughout her career, right down to the present day. My instinct, in other words, is that in offering a series of 101 different experiments and exercises that use photography both inside and outside the classroom, in order to encourage us to see things differently, to see things we might not otherwise have seen, and even to see more profoundly and deeply, Learn to See is a kind of training manual on how to see in general. And for this reason, I wish to suggest this early project tells us what is true of all of her books and projects, each of them including Carnival Strippers, Pandora's Box, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Kurdistan, but also all the others, are themselves training manuals on how to see, on how to read images, and especially in Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Kurdistan, on how to read images historically, and particularly in moments of danger. In the brief time I have with you this evening, I want to turn to one of the experiments in Learn to See in order to demonstrate what I mean here. I want to begin with a seriality of photographs, with the fact that every photograph belongs in a series, and that it is even fissured from within by its own seriality, by its ties to other images, relations, and histories. Sometimes we all just need batteries. You know. But a seriality that must be understood in terms of interruption rather than succession. This seriality will enable us to think about the question of the distance and proximity between befores and afters. And what will mediate this reflection is the exercise she developed with her students entitled Photo Swap. Linked to other experiments in Learn to See, this exercise is very much about the stories we tell or invent in relation to the images before us. What is at stake in this exercise is the possibility of creating a narrative that can account for the link between two photographs taken at different times and in different places, that can offer a story that brings them together, one after another, but sometimes with an after that, not surprisingly, is already associated with a before. And in so doing, allows us to see something particular about these two images and something about photography more generally. I first thought of this particular exercise in relation to a diptych that Susan drew from a contact sheet from one of the rolls of film that she shot in 1989. This diptych belongs to a series composed entirely of diptychs that she considered together under the title From Home to the Field. I love the formal organizing principle of this series. Susan decided that she would interrupt a roll of film wherever she was in it, and she would not take another picture until she had traveled somewhere else. In this new place, she would take an image, and then she would form a diptych composed of the last image she took in the last place she had been, and the first image she took in her new context. Then, like the students in her photo swap class, she would try to think about what might link the two images, taken at different times and in different places, about what words might account for how these two images came to be alongside one another. If we can come to understand the visual and historical dynamics between these two images, we could perhaps begin to understand the way in which all images interact with one another, whenever they are put next to one another, the way in which, never appearing alone, all images demand that we read them in relation to other images, and across the distance on the basis of which all relations are established. I want to turn from home to the field and to one of the photo swaps that compose it, in order to draw some lessons from it about the activity of reading photographs in general, and of reading them historically in particular. The diptych in question is composed first of an image of Susan's family in upstate New York in the summer of 1989, and second, of the image she takes on first arriving in Nicaragua some weeks later to work on the film, Pictures from a Revolution, an image of a cross marking the very site on which she had 11 years earlier found the Cuesta del Plomo torso. This is a very famous image, which I'll show you in a minute, of a half-eaten torso on a hillside. How is it that we can put these two images, these two worlds, into proximity with one another? The most direct answer would perhaps be to simply say, through photography. But to say this is just the beginning of a mystery, since the real question is, what is it in photography that permits us to put these so seemingly distant images alongside one another and indeed what happens when they find themselves next to one another. While there is perhaps something accidental about this juxtaposition, it is of course the result of a deliberate experiment, and therefore something closer to a planned accident. This is why we are invited to imagine the motivations behind this pairing, even if some of these motivations remain unconscious. What is perhaps first worth noting is that almost immediately after her arrival in Nicaragua, Susan returns to this entirely overdetermined site, at least in relation to her psychological, emotional, historical, and political investments. This can scarcely be an accident since, as she has confessed, she is drawn like a magnet to sites of disappearance. That this second image evokes the photograph she took of the half-eaten torso of a rebel fighter on this same site in 1978 suggests that this diptych is at least a triptych that begins with this mutilated body on the hillside, and therefore again unsettles the linearity that we would generally expect to exist between a before and an after. The first image of her family is taken before the second image in the diptych, but after her first encounter with this particular execution site in Nicaragua. To say that the photograph can circulate, that it raises questions about the relation between the past and the present, is perhaps not enough, however, and this is where we might register the real force of her later project, Reframing History. What is necessary is to retrace the effects. This is the moment when she goes back and installs the mural-size image of the half-eaten torso in the place where it had been taken. What is necessary is to trace the effects of installing this particular image in this particular site at this particular moment. And this even though a photograph can never have a fixed relation to either its provenance or its later iterations. The force of reinserting this particular image on the hillside in which Susan had found this half-eaten torso 25 years earlier, a well-known site of many assassinations near Managua that were carried out by the National Guard before and during the insurrection, has to do with the force of recalling a body in a landscape that no longer seems to remember it, and at a time when the government and the people also have forgotten much of what took place on this site so many years ago. If the National Guard disposed of the body here, it was because it wanted it to be seen as a warning and deterrent to other rebels. Taking the photograph in that context, in order to expose the violence of the government by recontextualizing the image within a counter-narrative, is very different than displaying it at another moment and in another historical political context. But in both instances, the aim is to keep this remnant of a body from being forgotten, to keep this singular death and everything it represents from being lost to history. If this reproduction of a lifeless torso is to speak, though, if it is to bear witness to the atrocities it underwent, and that also served as part of the context that led to its destruction, if we are to begin to understand everything it represents, we need to reconstruct the history that is sealed within it, and that is invisible within the frame of the image. This is why, as Benjamin explains in his 1931 Little History of Photography, in the long run it is the inscription or caption of a photograph that becomes its most important feature, since it is what helps us tell this history, since it can become the shifting register of the always changing significance of an image across time and space. In this regard, it is interesting that in a small text in which Susan discusses this image, she tells us that the image was never published in a magazine, and that instead she felt as if she had to make a book to hold this particular image as one of 71 photographs, that the whole book was made to contextualize this one image. Among so many other things, this suggests that we can only read an image by putting it in relation to other images, by surrounding it with other materials that together form part of the image's caption, part of the context within which it can be read. We can only read an image, that is, by reading it historically, but without ever imagining that we can fully saturate the context, without which we could never even approach it, and this because the image can never be entirely illuminated by its several contexts, because it simultaneously transforms them. Every image in Reframing History makes this indelibly clear. In order to press this point differently, and at the very limits of what can be represented, We could even say that it is this half-eaten body that is the real caption of Susan's photograph, that becomes the secret alphabet that has to be read and given language, that has to be transformed into words and sentences. This means that the three images form a kind of ensemble, which would of course include many other related images, and perhaps minimally all the images she published in her book on Nicaragua, and that she has stated form the context for her earlier image, and therefore have to be read in relation to one another. What is at stake each time is a story about what the eye can see and what it cannot, about what the camera can capture and of what eludes it. To say this, however, is simply to say that our experience of the diptychs that compose From Home to the Field is always an experience of the eye, of an eye that seeks to see where it does not see, where it no longer sees, or where it does not yet see. But what is it that we see and cannot see in these images? If we follow the protocols laid out in the exercises from Learn to See that teach us to look for visual rhymes across different shapes and forms, and even tones and colors, we can begin to invent a story that might help us account for the relations between these images. We might start with the fact that the female figure, with her arms outstretched, about to step into the pond, here serves as a kind of mediating form between the different photographs Susan took on the Cuesta del Plomo. The Cuesta del Plomo is the name of the hillside. The first one in 1978, and the later one in 1989. In the movement from the Y of the torso to the T of the cross, the female body appears as both a Y and a T, and therefore marks the transition between this earlier and this later photograph. A transition that is signaled in the fact that she is about to step into water, which as a force of dissolution and transformation, perhaps anticipates and even facilitates her disappearance into the cross in the next image. There are several other formal elements to which we can pay attention as well, but I will only mention three here. First, there is a kind of visual echolalia between the shape of Lake Managua in the distance, the lake here, in the distance, on the right of the diptych, and the shapes of the rippled circles around the two waterspouts that emerge from the pond. There is even a second circular shape in the plain below the cross in the Nicaragua image. Second, the lighter tone landscape in the area closest to the cross and extending into the plain, and the darker color of the hills in the upper left part of the photograph are a visual rhyme of the lighter color of the water closest to the woman and the darker tones of the water as it moves away from her, and especially in the upper left part of the photograph. Third, the frame of the diptych's first image includes a cut-off torso. On its right edge, behind the standing woman, which references, at least in the context of my suggestion, that this image is haunted by its relation to the image that is to come, and to the one that precedes the diptych altogether, even if only obliquely and in a displaced fashion. The torso and arm in her earlier image, a torso and arm that get reattached in the cross that simultaneously marks their absence. As a result of these relays, there are several exchanges or swaps that take place between the photographs. Water is exchanged for a landscape. A female figure is swapped for a cross. A cross has appeared in exchange for a body that is no longer present. A living fragment of a body appears as a substitute for a half-eaten torso. Circular bodies of water seem to cross the borders of a picture's frame. And given that rebels were disappeared on the hillside, as well as along the shores of Lake Managua, a commemorative marker shares its work with a body of water that is both a grave and an always shifting activity of remembrance and forgetting. In addition, an image that presumably is more closely associated with a sense of home for Susan, since it includes a number of her family members, is exchanged for an image that is more distant from whatever Susan might call her home. But as a result of the exchanges that take place here, the presumed familiarity of this proximity to her family is interrupted by the intervention of the image that follows it, and that introduces a darkness and death into the earlier image's more idyllic setting, in the same way that the torso she finds more than a decade earlier introduce death and disappearance into the beauty of the Nicaraguan landscape. This play between life and death, between tranquility and devastation, inhabits each of the images we're considering, and in so doing undoes the stability of the home referenced in the title of this project, and therefore makes it impossible for home to refer to a single, unambiguous site, something that is reinforced by all the other homes that are the starting points of Susan's other diptychs. Indeed, the multiplicity of these several other homes not only suggests the mobility of her sense of home, which could indicate that she either does not have a fixed sense of home, or that she is able to find a home nearly everywhere, but also as a counter to this, the way in which the one constant in every one of these diptychs, the one thing that remains in each of them, is her relation to photography, as if she has found a sense of home in relation to her camera, and perhaps even in its itinerancy. This would suggest that the trajectory from home to the field is not really a qualitative shift, since the field has become a kind of home for her, as much as all the different homes from which she begins in this series suggest that her home is never simply her home, but always something else, something always in the process of being made. To begin to formalize the lessons that can be drawn from this rather remarkable diptych, I would like to say that the fact that every detail here can potentially become exchanged for another one, and even more than another one. For example, the female figure can become a cross, and then by association, the missing body to which the cross refers, suggests the continual distortions and displacements from which the photographic detail or subject emerges, but always as an other. The movement of disfiguration linked to the chiasmic plurality of the image's interwoven figures makes it impossible to isolate the images from each other. In addition, where everything can become something else, nothing is ever just itself. Because figures are always haunted by other figures, are always bearing the traces of the other, they are always themselves and not themselves at the same time. My students will know this little story, but I'll say it because I love telling this little story, and it's linked to this. Benjamin has this really wonderful theory of smiles. He suggests that when you smile at someone, you enter into a secret contract that implies that you want to be them. So I smile at Makis, and this means I want to be Makis. It's not so untrue. And of course, when you're about to have your picture taken, the command is always smile. So if you put this command together with this little anecdote, then when you're about to have your picture taken, what you're being told is, get ready to become someone other than who you are. Which is why when you're looking at your photograph, you very often say, that doesn't look like me. Okay. What gets signaled here is not only the structure of photography in general, that when you enter into the photographic space, you always enter it as an other, a structure that names simultaneously the affirmation and loss of identity that attends the entry into a photographic space, but also a mode of creating images that performs at the level of its details what it wants us to understand, and achieves this whether it does so consciously or not. Indeed, that the two images that form this diptych belong together is confirmed for me not simply by the reading I'm offering here, but also by a very beautiful series of sentences in which Susan discusses the moment in which she is making pictures from a revolution, the moment, of course, when she makes the second image of this diptych. In these sentences, she not only steps into a body of water, just like the woman who steps into the water in the diptych's first image, but she also registers the power of history to move her in directions she perhaps did not expect, to proceed without her, and because of this, to introduce a sense of loss that perhaps leads her inevitably back to the site where she so many years earlier had taken the image of the Cuesta del Plomo torso, since this site is linked to a history that she can clearly never leave behind and will always include her. In these sentences, she says, and this is in the second passage in your handout, embarking on the kind of journey I did through Nicaragua and El Salvador is a bit like stepping into a body of water, the depth of which is unknown until you take the plunge. There's the tension between how deep the water is and how far you're willing to explore. You can be overpowered by a current and lose your balance. I know there were times when I allowed myself to experience that. The pull of history is powerful, but at some point one has to rebalance, recalibrate, get to the other side of the river. Pictures from a revolution is the point where I pull myself out of the river. I'm on the bank at the other side. I'm looking at the end of the story, at least my part in it. It's going on without me, and there's a lot of sadness. What this diptych triptych tells us is that reading images historically involves reading them in relation to other images and histories, tracing in the one image the disfigured and transformed traces of the others. Each of these photographs becomes an event in the other ones, repeats itself in them, even as its repetitions are only the return, the virtually infinite return of what is never the same. It is in the possibility of our being able to read these relations and differences that we can begin to register what we might mean by the historical dimension of images. This is why we must read an image in relation to what precedes and follows it, and why the task of reading historically demands that we not only trace the manner in which a photograph shares some of its elements with other photographs, how it is situated within a particular or general historical context, how it is inscribed in a series of images and relations, but also what remains idiomatic in an image, how it confirms this context even as it betrays it, distances itself from it in order to respect it. What Susan's diptych tells us, especially when viewed through the lens of photoswap and all its related visual exercises, is that what enables us to read images is our capacity to invent a story, a skeletal narrative, not a thin outline, however, but a deeply archival, material, and embodied account of how these images are articulated. They can bring together histories that are at least as invisible as they are visible, and they can join images taken at different times and in different places in ways that can open up their historical and material secrets. If we follow these protocols, understanding that in each instance they have to be reinvented in relation to the specific context within which we are working, we can begin to read images across Susan's corpus in new, unexpected, and I believe, rich and productive ways. You saw I flipped a little early. Okay. For example, reading the visual rhymes between different forms and shapes permits us to think about the relations between these two images. The image on the left was taken outside of Masaya, Nicaragua in 1979, and it documents the government's insistence on searching everyone traveling by bus, truck, or foot to see if any link could be established between the travelers and the Sandinista rebels. The image on the right was taken in El Salvador in 1980, and again documents a moment in which bus passengers are being searched and interrogated by the National Guard, this time along the Northern Highway. As in the earlier image, the soldiers are looking for evidence of any alliance or sympathy between the passengers and, in this instance, the FMLN guerrilla movement. If in the one photograph Susan photographs the passengers directly, in the other she photographs them indirectly by looking not at them, but at their shadows. This exchange of bodies for shadows is significant and speaks to the difficulty of looking directly at the brutality that was so evident in El Salvador at this time. And that, as Susan once said, was much more difficult to look at than anything she ever saw in Nicaragua, including the Cuesta del Plomo torso. The shadows are at the same time threshold figures that, casting their outlines on the wall, imprint a play between presence and absence that would become the signature of the military dictatorship's forced disappearances. In the move from passengers to shadows, the shadows announce the potential disappearance of the bodies seen in the first image and the ones referenced indirectly in the second one, and point to the fear and precariousness that define the everyday experience of the people who found themselves under the right-wing military regimes that governed most of Latin America throughout the 1970s and 1980s. A means of eliminating opposition and terrorizing the population at large, disappearances erased a person from both life and death, even denying relatives a body over which to grieve. Without dead bodies, the governments could deny knowledge of people's whereabouts and any accusations that they had been killed. As Argentinian dictator General Jorge Rafael Videla stated in a now infamous press conference, "They are neither dead nor alive, they are disappeared." If the juxtaposition of these two images permits us to think about the kidnappings, the torture, the murder and disappearances of tens of thousands of people all across Latin America, they also permit us to think more precisely about the relations and differences between the way in which these different forms of violence manifested themselves in Nicaragua and El Salvador during this same period. I also believe that the second image may never have been produced if Susan had not already taken the first one. This is to say that the image she took in El Salvador is haunted and mediated by the image taken in Nicaragua. It would not have been possible for her to take the second image without having the first one in mind, either directly or indirectly. And this again reinforces the sense of how we always carry our history with us, of how our eyes are composed of everything we have seen, and of how it is only through these mediations that we can begin to see at all. While this pairing is perhaps more easily legible, since both images tell a story of bus passengers being searched, even if one does so more indirectly, this attention to formal visual rhymes also permits us to see relations between images that do not immediately share this kind of thematic proximity, as I already have suggested in relation to the two diptychs from Susan's From Home to the Field project. It becomes possible, for example, to begin to read relations between images such as these three here, drawn from Susan's work in El Salvador and Kurdistan. The first image depicts a firing range in Usulitán, El Salvador, which was used by the US-trained Atlacatal Battalion. Taken in 1983, the photograph presents a series of rows of silhouetted figures in a landscape, with every silhouette a representation of a person who can be targeted and killed. The second image, taken in June 1992, presents the new cemetery of Gotapa, where villagers from mass graves were reburied. And the third image, also taken in 1992, presents a field in northern Iraq, dotted with anonymous graves of children killed in the Anfal campaign. I want to put these images alongside one another, not only because of the formal relays between them, the exchanges that are legible between the silhouetted targets and the grave markers, for example, with an increased disorder in the latter's placement as we move from left to right, invite us to read these images in relation to one another, but also as a preliminary way of answering a question Susan once asked me, and I referenced this question in my preliminary remarks. In a discussion about the relation between her different projects, she at one point said that as she moved from El Salvador to Kurdistan, she changed continents, but she then asked, what is it that remains the same? In many respects, my discussion of Susan's photo swap exercise and of the way in which it permits us to think about how we might read the relations between images taken at different times and in different places has been a way of beginning to respond to this question. Now, by placing these images from El Salvador and Kurdistan next to one another, I can perhaps be more precise, at least in regard to these images. One thing that remains the same in this particular shift from El Salvador to Kurdistan is, not surprisingly, Susan's attraction, or minimally her camera's attraction, to documenting violence and exterminations, disappearances, and mass graves. If the image of the firing range points to a moment of preparation, a moment of the anticipation of targeted killings, the two images of grave sites mark the moment after different murders and disappearances, and embody more sober moments of remembrance and commemoration. There is a kind of silence and serenity to the three images, despite the references to the violence and killing that took place either before or after the moments in which they were taken. What also remains the same then is not only Susan's insistence that many of the most important things about a photograph are invisible in it, are outside of its frame, even if they have nevertheless left their traces in it, but also the very real commitment on her part to exposing the traces of injustice wherever it occurs, whether in Latin America or in Kurdistan or really anywhere. As I've wanted to suggest, this commitment corresponds to the political promise of a mode of reading that begins in the exchange of images and histories from different times and places in order to help us imagine ties and relations where we might never have imagined they existed. But this gesture of making history with photographs begins in a very modest way, in the recognition of the capacity of a photograph to serve as a kind of memorial for the disappeared. There's a beautiful series of images in Susan's Kurdistan project, in which photographs of the disappeared are worn in their memory. This is perhaps one of the most beautiful of them, an image of family members wearing the photographs of Peshmerga martyrs in the Saiwan Hill Cemetery in Erbil in northern Iraq. There is something very simple but very moving in this image, and I simply wish to leave it here suspended, like a kind of pendant that rhymes with the images pinned, but floating on the clothing of these mourning women. I would dare to say that everything I have suggested tonight is sealed and encrypted in this image, waiting for us to read it and to unpack its several worlds together. Everything is here, which is to say that everything is also not here, beyond its frame, even as we are invited once again to read all its present but invisible traces. Traces that would reference, without referencing in a fixed and final way, all the worlds sealed within it. And of course, all the worlds, all the unforeseeably mediated relations sealed within Susan and her itinerant eyes, including those that signal the disappearance and reappearance of subjects who can never be just one. In order to begin closing my remarks this evening, I wish to turn to the question of the trace and to the possibility of retaining a trace of the dead. And this because of what I would call Susan's love of the trace, her devotion to it. A love and devotion that are perhaps intensified because she knows it can never be captured or ever be made present. It is always linked to a loss, to something that is past and is no longer present, to what can never coincide with its presumed referent. In fact, the existence of the trace confirms the absence of whatever left it behind. It is because of her passion for the trace that she is drawn like a magnet to mass graves, destroyed villages, the missing. And this because to love the trace is indeed to love photography, since the very practice of photography begins in its relation to the trace, to what is now absent. Indeed, when we have an image in our hand, this is the best indication that what we have in our hands is not what was photographed. Which is why the photograph is structured around the absence of what it presumably represents, and why death and mourning belong to the photographic experience. In particular, I want to recall one of her images from Nicaragua, an image that references the relations among death, mourning, traces, and activities of witnessing, even as it also reflects on the capacities and incapacities of photography itself. As I wish to suggest, Susan is drawn to the scene of death and mourning, not only because of her compassion for life and her commitment to exposing injustice, but also because this photograph is also a photograph of what makes photography what it is and what it is not. The image I wish to discuss, taken in Nicaragua in 1979, shows a father collecting the remains of his assassinated son, who has been identified by a shoe lying nearby. The remains of the son form another Y, with their outline left on the ground beside it, a kind of ghostly trace of the burnt cadaver the father has so lovingly tried to retrieve. The remains can scarcely remain together or intact, however, and are in a state of continuous deterioration. Already part of the son's remains have been left behind on the ground. The remains that are meant to reference and memorialize the body of the dead son, in other words, are in the process of disintegrating even further and cannot any longer refer to the son's body, if they ever did. They are remains that do not remain. This is why, as Maurice Blanchot noted so movingly in his 1951 essay, Two Versions of the Imaginary, in which he famously identifies the image with the cadaver. This is in the handout. What we call mortal remains escapes common categories. Something is there before us, which is not really the living person, nor is it any reality at all. It is neither the same as the person who was alive, nor is it another person, nor is it anything else. End quote. If we view this photograph through the lens of this passage, we can conclude that the son's remains are neither present nor absent. They testify without testifying because among so many other things, they testify to the destruction of memory itself. This is why we might say these remains can never correspond to that of which they are supposed to be the trace. I would even go so far as to say that in every trace, and even in every experience, there is this destruction. This experience of destruction, which is experience itself. And I would say the same for the photograph, since it too can never correspond with what is before the camera. There is always so much more in a photograph than what we can see on its surface, and at the same time, never enough. Which is why Susan always feels compelled to supplement the image by surrounding it with other images, and by trying to reconstruct all the histories that are encrypted within it. The photograph itself is never enough, since by itself, it can never match what is inside it. And this because of everything that outside it and beyond its frame has left its traces on its surface. In this instance too, the dead sun, having become an image, even if a material one, the ashes to which the sun has been reduced are themselves a trace, an image of him, just as the photograph Susan took is still an image of him, at least of him as he is now, or as he is not now, has become something that cannot be grasped. As Blanchot would put it, the cadaver itself, and the cadaver as the thing to which the one who was once alive has been transformed. This is in the handout as well. It is not the same thing at a distance, but the thing as distance, present in its absence, graspable because ungraspable, appearing as disappeared. It is the return of what does not come back. He who just died is at first extremely close to the condition of a thing, a familiar thing which we approach and handle, which does not hold us at a distance, but now he is dead. From behind there will no longer be an inanimate thing, but someone, the unbearable image and figure of the unique becoming nothing in particular. It is striking that at this very moment, when the cadaverous presence is the presence of the unknown before us, the mourned deceased begins to resemble himself. End quote. It's an extraordinary passage. There would be a great deal to say about these passages, but what I wish to emphasize here is that like the remains of a cadaver, every photograph is also the return of what does not come back. It is the trace, the visual repetition of something that, even at the very moment in which the photograph was taken, is already in the process of becoming something else. What Blanchot suggests is that we do not have to wait until we encounter a cadaver to know that we are always becoming someone or something else. But once we do encounter a cadaver, this truth becomes ineluctable. This is why he suggests we come to ourselves, we come to understand something about ourselves, as the ones who are never just ourselves, or at least not the same ourselves from one moment to the next, when we encounter a cadaver. Since it is there, in this encounter, that we come closest to the mortality that we not only share, but that makes us who we are. It is in this encounter with death that we come to resemble ourselves, as mortal and finite beings. It is because we are defined by our mortality and finitude that we are both made and unmade by our images, by the images we are, but also by the images we create. This is why photography tells us we can always only love ruins, because we can always only love what is mortal. In this instance, this photograph of ruin, minimally the record of an incineration, of a dead sun, and of the body of the dead sun, suggests the ruin of the image's capacity to show, to represent, to address and evoke the persons, events, truths, histories, lives, and deaths to which it would refer. What makes the image an image is its capacity to bear the traces of what it cannot show, to go on in the face of this loss and ruin, to suggest and gesture toward its potential for speaking. Even as the trace of the sun's body continues to deteriorate, even when we take a lesson from it about our own finitude, it still remains as a vanishing trace. Indeed, even when an image tells us it can no longer show anything, when it reaches the limit of what it can show, it nevertheless still strives to show and bear witness to what history has sought to silence. This is particularly true, it seems to me, of this next image, which presents victims of the Mozotes massacre in El Salvador, which took place on December 11, 1981, just a few weeks before Susan took her picture in January 1982. Rather than pursuing a reading of this image that would rhyme with the one I've just offered, in this image too, the corpses are images of victims who are no longer present, who've been transformed into something in between a person and a thing, who cannot coincide with the image at which we are looking. I here wish to emphasize the ways in which the images Susan took of rotting bodies and burnt homes in the Morazan area of El Salvador circulated and eventually became part of the evidence of the massacre. Evidence that could be used against the various denials of both the Salvadorian government and the U.S. State Department. Although the guerrillas had announced the massacre soon after it happened, the U.S. State Department claimed that it sent its own investigative team into the area and found no evidence of a massacre. Prompted by this denial, and by the continued assertions by the guerrillas and survivors of the incident, Susan went to the area with the journalist Raymond Bonner to document what she could see, which included the charred skulls and bones of men, women, and children, and what she could learn from survivors of the massacre. Published alongside accounts of the slaughter by Bonner and Alma Guillermo Prieto in the New York Times and the Washington Post, respectively, in January 1982. Guillermo Prieto had entered Mozote a few days after Susan and Bonner did, and she also reported seeing the remains of bodies and body parts, and also cited the same survivors. Susan's images were presented as documentation of the atrocities that had taken place during the massacre. Despite these documented accounts of army troops, including members of the U.S.-trained Atacatal Battalion, destroying the town of El Mozote and killing hundreds of men, women, and children, however, both governments continued to deny the massacre, and it was not until 1993 that the UN Truth Commission authorized an investigation of the incident, pressing the Salvadorian government to excavate the ruins of El Mozote's sacristy, where a forensic team found the skulls of 143 individuals, most of them children. The UN in its report concluded, given the limited information it had at that time, that over 200 people had been killed in the incident, even though survivors of the massacre claimed that as many as 1,000 villagers were killed. Much of this was documented in Mark Danner's 1993 New Yorker essay, The Truth of El Mozote, and in his meticulously documented and expanded book, The Massacre of El Mozote, which was published the following year. But the exhumations and investigations of the massacre have continued to this day, and Susan's photographs are still essential parts of the evidence being put forward to confirm the scope of the slaughter. I've wanted to recall this sequence of events simply to emphasize that what gets exposed in this process is not only the evidentiary force of a photograph, but also its incapacity to stand alone. Not because the Salvadorian government and the Reagan administration denied what the photograph shows. These denials are scarcely surprising at all, but because its force can only be intensified and clarified when it is inscribed within a narrative, a fact that has circulated in this lecture like a red thread, and that is confirmed on so many fronts by Susan's own insistence on this point. If the photograph would seem to have to be inscribed into a narrative in order to consolidate its evidentiary status, I wish to insist that it was already evidence the moment she captured the scene within the lens of her camera. In this context, this means at least two things. One, that the evidence provided by the photograph can never be understood solely in terms of its relation to the reality to which it presumably refers, since however referential we may think the photograph is, it can never be decisive or definitive on its own. And two, the evidentiary character of the photograph can never be entirely erased. It remains. These bodies were killed and left to rot. Documenting this is an irreplaceable and invaluable act, regardless of whether or not what is shown is denied, independently of whether or not people act on what is shown directly and decisively. If we say that a body is killed, however, perhaps the question that remains is what it means to say that a body is killed. Or rather, what is it that is killed? when a body is killed. This would include all the relations and histories that had left their traces in this body, and that enabled it to always be more than a body and less than one. This is why the image Susan produced has to be considered in terms of the broader context or narrative into which its testimony is situated, and in relation to how it is presented and by whom. This means, as Tom Keenan has argued in an essay on Alan Sekula's writings on the ambiguous documentary character of photography, that, and this is the final passage on the handout, by itself, the imprint of the trace decides nothing, settles nothing, determines nothing, forces no conclusions. Conclusions, decisions happen in an altogether different realm and depend on differing presentational circumstances and conditions of use. This indeterminacy of meaning does not hold in spite of the inexactality of the image, but because of it. Because there is a trace, an imprint, there is the possibility of interpretation, the opportunity for meaning, fiction, and hence the battleground of fictions. Because there is a trace, there is a battle. Around the image a debate can begin. We decide what it says. It does not. It cannot. End quote. If the image of the father seeking to gather the remains of his son suggests the incapacity of the photograph to coincide with the photographed, this second image similarly points to the inability of the photograph to remain on the side of evidence all by itself. This is not to say that the photograph is not from the very beginning evidence, but simply to insist that we always need to state what it is evidence of. In both instances, the referential character of the photographic trace is unsettled, even if for different but related reasons. These are photographs, in other words, that not only tell us something about the moment in which they were taken, and about the several histories that are sealed within that moment, but also about the structure and character of photography itself, and about its capacity for decontextualizing its subjects. Indeed, this force of decontextualization belongs to the violence of all images, and perhaps particularly to the violence of images of violence, since violence is always accomplished in an image. In other words, and here we may follow Benjamin's own critique of violence, violence is registered when the production of its effects is indissociable from its manifestation. In his 1960 afterword to Dream Tigers, Jorge Luis Borges writes of a man who sets out to draw the world. Over the years, he tells us, the man peopled a space with images of provinces, kingdoms, mountains, bays, ships, islands, fishes, rooms, instruments, stars, horses, and individuals. A short time before he dies, he discovers that the patient labyrinth of lines traces the image of his face. Borges imagines a man who spends his life creating and collecting images, and who, near the end of his life, comes to understand that the various trajectories of his life trace the image, the lines, and the outline of his face, offering, in a sense, a kind of self-portrait. But a portrait that is a composite of everything he has seen and experienced is never simply a portrait of just himself, but also of all the relations that have helped make him who he is, as the one who is never simply just himself. I want to close with this reference because I believe that among the many things Susan's photographs has given us is a portrait of everything she is. Someone who understands the relations that both constitute and deconstitute our sense of self. Someone who understands that however difficult and even impossible it may seem to insist on memory, we must still imagine a means of remembering what remains without remaining. What, even if it is destroyed and ruined, even if it is in transit or passing before us, still demands to be preserved, even if within a history that can never enter into history. This obligation delineates the stakes of all of her photographic projects, and it also tells us why she believes that we must learn to read the past, and more precisely the irretrievable images of the past, in a way that, following Benjamin, knows how these images threaten to disappear as long as we do not recognize ourselves in them. This is why, as the Italian artist Salvatore Puglia would have it, what remains for us is to collect the fleeting images of what has disappeared, to recollect the floating fragments of this history of disappearance. What remains is the possibility of a gesture, to hand, to hold out, in the scattered memories to which we are condemned, some vestigia, some expressions of a multiple anamnesis. What remains are perhaps the remarkable gifts Susan has given us in all her photographs, each one of which hopes to open at least a door, if not many doors, so that we can perhaps learn to see a little better each day. It is because of her passion for justice, because of her courage to show what others often dare not show, that we remain indebted to her, to everything her work has given us to think, and to everything she continues to give us. It is because of the grace and kindness with which she inhabits the world that we also can bear to inhabit it, that we also can find the strength to continue to try, as Emerson once said, to set one stone aright every day. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now we can talk. My students know I love to talk. I don't need much of a prompt, so just even a flick of a finger. Take the difficult images. Yes. I think the easiest way to say it is that in some sense what I'm suggesting is that you look at a photograph, it's a flat surface, but it bears the traces of an entire network of relations, of historical relations. And so that one has to learn how to read what's not visible in the photograph, right? So I started out with a diptych, right? And I have the cross. But that cross is already haunted by the earlier image of the torso. And that you have to read, you can only read that cross in relation to that earlier image of the torso. But that image of the torso, she claims, was never presented in a magazine, never, and in fact she had to produce an entire book with over 70 images that would provide a context for that image. In other words, that single image could not have been read without those other 70 images. Exactly. So you know, you have an image, and this is why I say that you can never read an image alone. It always has to be read in relation to other images. This is how one begins to read things historically. You have to read an image in relation to what's before and after. And I think that for me, this is why I wanted to close with this. And to be honest, this is still the most difficult part for me, and let's say the part that I anguished over the most, was exactly those last two images. Not this one, the previous two, right? Because, as you say, the image, this remarkable image of this man trying to retrieve the traces of incinerated sound. And the why of part of his body is on the ground. So this is an image, as you say, that suggests that a photograph is incapable of referencing the referent, which is to say it's incapable of bearing witness to what really happened. Right? And yet, Susan, I can't stay there with Susan. Right? I mean, as an old deconstructionist, I would stay there. Right? I mean, I would stay there. So this is a fantastic image for an old deconstructionist. Right? But Susan thinks of herself as a documentary photographer. She will say, my eyes saw that. So I cannot stay there and respect that part of her project. So what I was trying to do was think of the way in which, okay, the Mozote image, which by the way is presently being used as evidence in a trial, it's been a very complicated thing for Susan, because Susan has gone on record as saying that there is no image that she's ever taken that belongs just to her. It's a fabulous thing for her to say. And yet, this picture can only enter into evidence in court by her flying to El Salvador, going into the courtroom and saying, this is my image, this is what my eyes saw, I am the author of this image, which she just did a few months ago. So this is so that it cannot be entered into the court as evidence unless it has an author, somebody who says, repeats, I bear witness that this is my image, and this image bears witness to what my eyes saw. So what became interesting to me and difficult for me as an old conservationist is that, yeah, I know somebody joked with me once, well, there are no longer any young ones. I hope that's not true. But no. So, that it is evidence. Let's say it's evidence. Then the question becomes, I mean, you can say it's evidence, but then that's just the beginning of the mystery. Because then the question is, what is it evidence of? And so when you see, this is why at one moment, I think it was a strong moment, for me when I say it is that when I'm talking about the image of the half-eaten torso, on the Costa del Cuomo torso, and I say that it's the torso itself that is the caption of the image. Right? That's the thing that needs to be read. Because that body, right, the bearing witness, what does that body bear witness to? That body bears witness to all the history that enabled that body to be found there at that moment. Right? The body, it's an archive. It's an archive. Right? So when you say, what is the relation between the evidentiary and the ghostly, they're a couple. They're inseparable. One can't be thought without the other one. Right? Every image, every piece of evidence bears the traces of innumerable ghosts. Right? And those ghosts, let's call them all the history that is sealed in that image, that is invisible, but has nevertheless left its traces on that surface. So we have to learn how to read what's not visible, which is my way of saying you have to learn how to read historically. And I think that the ethical political dimension of that command, let's say, has to do with the necessity and urgency of learning to read historically, specifically in moments of danger, because we live in a moment of danger. Right? And it is linked to, let's say, a longer, more in-depth reading of, among other things, Benjamin's work for this thing. Is that? I mean, so the relation, it's a couple. They're a couple.
Insisting on bearing witness as a register of photography while acknowledging the impossibility of bear witness has a particular
Yes. And it's the smartest thing. It's the only thing you can do. I'll give you an example. Fazl Sheikh, human rights photographer, New York-born Kenyan-Pakistani photographer, has a project called Moksha, which is on dispossessed widows in India. I know some of the story, most of you don't. So in India, you may know, the husband dies and the widow gets blamed for death. So they lose property, they get kicked out of the house, their sons disown them. So historically, for many, many decades now, these widows have gone to the city of Vrindavan, which has now become known as the city of widows. And they've devoted themselves to Krishna. Vrindavan is presumably the childhood playground of Krishna. So they go to this site, they devote themselves to Krishna, they become wives of Krishna, and they achieve moksha, heaven or salvation. So Sheikh does a project called Moksha on these dispossessed widows. And here's exactly what we say. You open up the project, and the first thing you see are these you see these photographs of painted scenes from the story of Krishna. Turn the pages. You have these blurry images of the entrance into the city of Vrindavan. Turn the pages. The first portrait of a widow. She's got her back to the camera, she's got a shawl over her, you can't see who she is. This is wildly smart, right? Because if you want to learn how to read this book, and what you basically have to do is follow the gaze of the camera. If you want to imagine that you can see or know or look at these widows, you have to pass through the story of Krishna, the history and story of Krishna. You have to pass through the history of this city, which is not just any city. And even then you may not be able to see this woman directly. So what's great about it, and this is exactly what you're saying, Adhika, is that you have a human rights photographer who wants to document and show the plight of these dispossessed widows. But that project includes within it already a meditation on the difficulty, if not the impossibility, of presenting the widows. This is really smart. So it's a means of bearing testimony that also includes an account, a meditation, a reflection on the possibility of bearing testimony. Which is, I think, what's so extraordinary about the image of the father with the incinerated son. That image, we could stay with that image for hours, everything that we can talk about. I know, I threatened to go on forever like a river, so nobody's going to want to ask any other questions. Yes?
What makes you think that you live in a mixed Asia?
That's a good question. I mean, it's almost an impossible question to answer, only because it's although I will say, this is the way I would put it. Like most things that are obvious, they take a long time to demonstrate. But you know, the students who've been in my class know that one of the things that I do. This I don't want. This I don't want. This. Just put it in. Just close. It's a Benjaminian sense of danger, right? And what Benjamin suggests is that we live in a moment in which, and this is what the danger always is, the danger is the always present possibility that without our knowing it, we can become tools of the oppressors. This is danger. It's always present. There's no safety zone. And what he then suggests is he's one of the great analysts, let's say, of the inevitability of political complicity. So I would say that we live in a moment of danger, as everyone has always lived in a moment of danger, precisely because we use a language that isn't just ours. So we don't have full control over the language we use. And so this means that our language is mediated by very many things that we think go in the direction of the worst. Okay? And this, I'll give an example. It's a great example. I was taking a class once. We were reading texts by German Jews between the two wars. And at one point, the professor said, what could anti-Semitism be if it were compatible with everything? If the very moment you open your mouth or thought a thought, you couldn't help but speak or think something that would be anti-Semitic. If this were the case, what could anti-Semitism be? So one student one student pointed to a Jewish group in Paris that had been working against anti-Semitism. The professor smiles, says, well, we all know how Jews can sometimes be anti-Semitic. He gave a history of this particular group, which he knew, and he showed that things they had done to fight anti-Semitism had actually produced, enacted, encouraged anti-Semitism. Somebody in the back of the room says vegetarianism as something that could in no way be considered anti-Semitic. He smiles again. He says, well, I've been thinking a lot about vegetarianism. A friend of mine just became vegetarian. Insofar as the Judaic tradition requires the notion of sacrifice, on a formal level, vegetarianism is anti-Semitic. Okay? So this is great, right? Because it doesn't mean, of course, that every vegetarian is in advance anti-Semitic. But what it means is, when you're way over here, and you think you're very far from what you think goes in the direction of the worst, watch out, because the way you're thinking could have relays with the very things that support and maintain this other way of thinking. Right? This is the inevitability of political complicity. Right? This is, you think you're fighting this over here, and without your knowing it, you're reinforcing the very thing that you want to go against. This is what danger is. We do live in this particular kind of danger. And it's a structural issue. It's a structural issue. It's impossible to not live in that condition for the reasons that are encrypted in this talk, which is that our perception is entirely mediated. So our perception is never just ours. And that fact means that we're always touched by others. There are all these hands out there just waiting.
You are waiting.
I'm very, very patient. Yes, here's a question. You mean the Magnum agency, not the foundation, the agency. Right. 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 Well, this is a very tricky part, because this not just that she's never displayed these images, she's never done anything with the project. I only found out about the project because she was invited last May in 2017. This is a gorgeous invitation, right? One would love to be invited to do this. She's invited to London for a photographer's gallery, and the invitation is to give a talk on the 8 photographs she would want to take with her if she were on a desert island. And which would be the 8 photographs? And it's kind of extraordinary to see her choose 8 photographs and which ones it would be. This is one of them. And I had never known this image. She sent me the link as I was starting to write about her. And this image was one of the ones that she wanted to take with her because this is her sister. It's her sister. Okay. This became, and you said, what happens with these? I mean, that she is able to do whatever she wants with these. What is she going to do with? She's not able to do everything she wants with them. In fact, I wasn't able to do anything I want with them because the sister prohibited us from identifying her as a sister. So, no, I did. It's of course, yes. But I mean, I couldn't do it in print, in writing. Yes, okay. But this is to say that it was. And in fact, she had to eventually erase her reference to this image in the online recording. Her sister actually didn't want it there. Because Susan's very well known, she thought it might become viral, it's a very private moment, she didn't want it visible. Right? So this is, in answer to the question of what happens with this kind of material, this material is in her studio. What's interesting about it, and then I'll say something more general about what you're asking. What's interesting about it is that the diptychs that she has shown me are always like this. The second image is always a scene of death. In every diptych she's shown me. The other one, for example, is one of her studio, when she's making her studio, building her studio in New York. So it's a shot of ripped floors, torn down walls. It's the beginning of her making of her studio in New York. Jump cut to the next image. The next image is a mass grave in Kurdistan. Yeah, but see, what I pointed this out to her, and she says, "Oh, it's just an accident." But of course it's not an accident, because she has. I mean, you cannot tell me that going to Nicaragua 10 years later and going to the site where she finds the torso, which was the most compelling thing she found when she was there, is an accident. It's not an accident. Right? She's driven to return to this overdetermined site. Right? Anyway, so this I just wanted to talk about the singularity and specificity of this particular diptych. But I think that it's increasingly the case that the photographers whether they're Magnum or not Magnum, are increasingly exploring the possibilities of using the internet. And I think that Susan has done online editions. She did an online collaborative project with Chilean photographers. We're in the process of a discussion right now of something that she might do on the history of collaboration within the history of photography and whether or not that would become online. If part of the question is also what difference does the digital make? I don't know if that's for you a question, but for me, again, as an old deconstructionist, the philosophical questions that are raised by both analog and digital photography are the same. That in other words, there is a difference between information and chemicals, but the questions about the relation between presence and absence, truth and fiction, remembering, forgetting, etc., are all there within the digital, but in an intensified, accelerated fashion. I know that's not a direct, yeah, okay.
No, I want to say there are no other questions, but not go to the rooftop to have a drink and stuff.
This is an invitation to the rooftop. Thank you very much.
Thank you.